Oh, that was quick. It usually loads forever, but here we are and live in the bleak midwinter. That season is right around the corner. But we're not going to talk about anything bleak or wintry because that is coming up. But today, I want to talk about this idea or perhaps myth of the starving artist. And I don't want to talk about it necessarily at first at the level of the individual, but instead about the societies and about the nations that produce great, prolific, profound, or popular art, whether it's music or other things. And obviously, there will be a focus primarily on music, given what this channel is, but we'll focus on other things too. Now, in our culture, both from a leftist and a rightist metaphysical and philosophical position, there is this idea that the best art comes from unfortunate conditions and unfortunate circumstances. And the leftist mindset tends to express this by revering the idea of the starving artist. You know, the man or woman living in squalor, not able to eat anything much, and through this pain and through this misfortune, the artist creates things that either in the artist's lifetime or after become popular, considered profound, etc. The rightists have a similar take on it. And this is expressed in an aphorism that many on the right have been reciting a lot lately. And this is, it's complex, so I'll try to get the order right. Hard times make strong men. Strong men make good times. Good times make weak men. Weak men make bad times. Rinse and repeat. And so the way that the rightists apply that to art is that great art comes through struggle. The bad times created by those lacking creativity, full of degeneracy, full of sloth. It creates bad times, which creates the heroic artist that struggles against the adversity of a crumbling society and helps to rebuild it alongside the engineers, the inventors, the workers who rise to the challenge. So you see how both from the left wing fetishization of the starving artist and the right wing fetishization of struggle, and I'm not saying fetishization in this case as a pejorative because struggle is real and suffering is real. But these are the myths of the starving artist. And again, we'll get back to what it may or may not mean at an individual level, but let's look at various great epochs of art through different societies, and let's explore whether these societies were experiencing a lot of prosperity and stability and growth, or whether they were experiencing the opposite. So let's start from a period that I think is a lot of people's favorite period for painting, sculpture, and architecture, and that's the Northern Italian Renaissance. Now, at this period of time, the republics and principalities of northern Italy, while small, were among the most wealthy shipping and even in invention, home to great inventors, places in the world. If you'll pardon that weird sentence. So places like the Republic of Venice, places like the Republic of Florence, they were very mighty countries. They punched above their weight. And what was going on at this time of great northern Italian republics and principalities? Well, you had Da Vinci, you had Michelangelo, you had the birth of Renaissance music, which some would say was the first sort of music that dared to be semi-secular in modern European history, or early modern European history, if we're going to be super accurate. You see all of this architecture, neoclassic, the sort of proto-neoclassical Renaissance architecture that lots of people throughout the world love and have copied, including by integrating elements of it in modern architecture. So, what does this all mean? Well, it's an example of places going through an economic boom that also had a parallel cultural boom. Let's look at the Spanish Golden Age, which followed the Reconquista of 1492, which, you know, if you know the poem, it was when Spain started to expand outwardly, the age of the great Spanish explorers and conquistadors. It was also an age where Spanish music had its modern roots. The guitar, as we know it today, had its roots in 15th century Spain, in the ongoing golden age of Spanish growth, and both economically and territorially. And while the modern guitar was really only standardized in the 19th century, the guitar, as we would generally recognize, oh, that's like a guitar. It came in this golden age of Spain. Look at the Elizabethan age, which was sometimes referred to as the English Renaissance. You have, well, Shakespeare, arguably the greatest playwright and poet of all time. Certainly in the English language, he's sort of in many ways the father of the modern English language. Many of the various turns of phrases and aphorisms that we integrate even into the most modern guttural of vernaculars come from Shakespeare. And again, it was an expanding society at that time. Let's take a look at the great German music boom of the late 18th and 19th century. Mozart, Beethoven, Schubert, Schumann, Liszt, Wagner. And when I say German, I really mean Germanic, because I mean the independent German principalities that would unite and form a united state in the 1860s and 1870s. And I'm also talking about Germanic Austria. And so there was a huge boom at this time, and that's because the Germany as a modern nation state was being invented. And this invention came about because of the rising tide of prosperity across much of the Germanic world. And look at all of the great music that came with it. Look at the rise of the Bourbons and the French Empire and all of the literature, architecture, and music that came out of that. And in the 19th century, when you had a strong British Empire, a strong French Empire, a consolidating and economically powerhouse German nation state for the first time in modern history, you also see something else. In musical scores prior to the 19th century, throughout Europe, all of the markings would be written in Italian. Andante, Allegro, Moderato. These are not just sizes of coffee cups at Starbucks. These are actual music markings that indicate things like tempi and intonation. The very word tempo, it's Italian, Latin derived. But in the 19th century, a lot of composers began writing these in their own languages. So by the mid 19th century, on a German score, you'll see words like klein and gross. You'll see on French scores written in French. Even in Russia, they started writing, and we'll get to Russia in a minute, in Russian. And yes, in English too, even though, let's be honest, what sounds more profound, moderato or medium, something medium? Yeah, not too fast, not too slow. I don't know. Maybe this is the bias of native speech, that we find other languages more interesting when we get familiar with some of their lexicon, but not all of it. Because maybe there's a guy in Italy who says, "Wow, that word medium, ooh, that gets the heart going." But you never know. And so there are other examples too. So why did Russian secular classical music, as we know it now in the Romantic style, only rise in the 19th century? Well, Russia's slow abandonment of feudalism and embrace of a more modern economic system really took place very slowly between the 18th and 19th centuries. But as Russia began to expand in that way, so too did they have a golden age of romantic music. And much like its society itself, with a very small middle class, most of the composers came from the aristocracy or professions that were aristocrat adjacent, like those in the military or those in the government. So there are countless other examples. Why is it that we are amazed at Roman architecture and Greek imperial architecture, whether the Alexandrian era or the Byzantine era? It's because these were societies that dominated regions and eventually dominated parts of the known world around them. And let's bring it up to date in the modern day. Which country invented pop music as we know it? The United States. When was it invented? It was invented in the Gilded Age, an era of immense technological and economic growth following the years of the 1860s when the country was plunged into a deadly war. And so, what was going on? Well, you had all sorts of American technologies, the self playing instrument, recorded sound, Thomas Edison and others. And pop music was invented because the publishing industry, which was big in England and France and Germany and huge in America, biggest audience, it said, well, we're going to sell the sheet music of popular songs. Folk music was transformed into pop music, and we're going to make piano rolls so that your player pianos can play this music, and self-playing organs, and then with recorded sound and the radio, etc. And ever since then, the United States has been the domineering nation creating pop music. It invented it, and of course, other powerful nations are sort of in a close second or third place. Rush came from Canada, didn't come from Djibouti. The Beatles came from England. They didn't come from Papua New Guinea. And this is just to say that throughout history, great empires, great states, those that are wealthy, those that expand, tend to foster great art, because just as sure as no man is an island, even though many artists try to be, except for Simon and Garfunkel, or no, they sort of willed it, I suppose. Great art requires infrastructure. If your country is in constant war, if your country is in a state of regressed and retarded primitivism, if your country is experiencing unbreaking famine, if your country isn't able to cope technologically or medicinally with natural disasters, there's not going to be the sufficient architecture, the sufficient infrastructure, rather, to create things like beautiful architecture, beautiful paintings, beautiful music. I mean, if you're in the middle of a famine, how are you going to rehearse and pay or even feed a big orchestra? How are you going to have the luxury of slowly painting all day when you're out there foraging for food or warding off the people that are throwing spears or stones or even bullets at you? And so, there is a logical and scientific reason why prosperity is associated with great art. Look at the Dutch masters. Those great painters like Rembrandt, they existed at a time when the Dutch Empire and the Dutch mercantile economy was at its apotheosis. And again, these rarely fail, these examples. Now, this isn't to say that there is always an artistic hegemon, although there sometimes is. When there are multiple relatively prosperous countries at once, you see a lot of great art coming simultaneously. Think of 19th century concert of Europe between 1815 and 1915, when a hell of a lot of art was coming more or less equally out of places like Germany, France, Britain, parts of Southern Europe, the more economically robust parts of Southern Europe, the places in Scandinavia that were experiencing economic growth for the first real time in centuries. And so all of this corresponds. Like I said, Russia, as it became less feudal, but in between the extended feudalism and the mistake of communism, Russia had a great artistic explosion as well. Um, and again, you even see it with individual minority groups within an empire. Look at the disproportional influence of Armenians on Russian and even Soviet art and music. Think of the great Aram Khachaturian. Perhaps, not perhaps, but I would say it's because even as a minority that for a long time was theoretically or technically stateless, I suppose, they punched above their weight because they were a merchant people, an inventive people. Look at the disproportional influence of Jewish artists in places like the United States. Similar scenario as Armenians in terms of art in the Soviet Union. So what does this fully obliterate the myth of the starving artist or the myth of difficult social or national situations creating difficulties when it comes to the creation of art? Not necessarily at all, because when you look at examples of specific artists, while the idea that all great artists are starving is just objectively false, there were a lot of great European composers and painters who were middle class. And like I said earlier, all of the great Russian composers of the 19th century were either from the aristocracy or aristocracy adjacent. But well, there are many examples of the starving or struggling artist, particularly in the artist's youth. Now, how does this relate to the prosperity thesis that we've been advancing all day? Well, it relates implicitly, because ask yourself this: would you rather be poor in a rich country or poor in a poor country? Now, that's an easy answer, because if you're poor in Renaissance Italy, the streets are relatively clean, the architecture is stable, you're not living in a mud hut, and because you're the commercial center of much of the world at the time, you're generally avoiding the instability that other less prosperous places would have. So even if you're poor and disenchanted, and even, or a political dissident even, in a wealthy nation, the infrastructure that's sufficient to allow you to create some level of art does exist, however much you might loathe your individual situation. um Now, obviously, it's better to be a rich person in a poor country than a poor person in a rich country. Just ask your favorite dictators of the third world that are driving Cadillacs and Rolls Royces. But again, that's the more nuanced question. When it comes just to comparative poverty, you'd rather be poor in New York City than in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. You'd rather be poor in 16th century Republic of Venice than in 16th century sub-Saharan Africa. That's just the basic laws of economics and of political realities. And so, what does all of this mean? Well, it means that the idea of the artist created through struggle, and of the which is the rightist point of view, and the artist created through suffering and poverty, which is the leftist sort of mythos. Both of these things have their sincere and accurate points. But much more than this, they are insufficient explanations, because the reality is great art comes in political systems that are stable and strong, in economies that are prosperous and typically growing, in states that have some sort of hegemonic control over a region or even much of the world. So, all of these things that people consider political or economic, GDP growth, imperial expansion, other forms of territorial influence, political stability through a strong as opposed to fractious political system, all of these things that sound contrary to the idea of art forged through struggle and art forged through suffering. I hate to break it to you, but these sort of the ideas, the somewhat unglamorous ideas of high GDP, political stability, territorial influence, and territorial expansion, all of these things historically, and I would argue presently, are associated with great and popular art. Now, is there an issue of exposure and distribution bias? Yes, to a degree. And let me explain what I mean by that. One of the things that benefits artists from living in a prosperous, politically stable, territorially expanding, or influential nation is because they have access to, at least in this modern age, and I would argue even before, they have access to exposure and distribution systems that are far wider and more professional than, let's say, a great artist living in a country with no such system. And the most obvious example, well, I'll give you two examples of it. The Italian Renaissance, great shipping powers. And that shipping meant that many different countries around Europe and beyond were exposed to Northern Italianate culture in the Renaissance and Baroque periods. And that was an artistic distribution system for the painters and musicians and architects even of that era. Let's go to the ultra modern era. Why is it that the United States has been so successful at exporting its art, its pop culture? It has both the technological and political means to do so. As the global superpower, and even during the Cold War, as a competing superpower, it had all of the physical, technological, economic, and political channels necessary to distribute their music. They sent people like Louis Armstrong to other countries to spread the gospel of Americana. They sent blood, sweat, and tears to the communist bloc. These are examples of distribution systems. And when you invent or co-invent or improve various recorded technologies, this is true as well. Look at Germany, strong in the 30s and 40s, invented magnetic tape. What became strong in the 50s, 60s, and beyond? The United States. They mastered, both literally and in the other sense, magnetic tape. And so, again, there is that bias, but I think at the same time, you have to say that one thing couldn't really exist with another. The thing that allows artists to have the infrastructure to take the time to cultivate their art in an area that's free of famine, of constant warfare, of constant coups d'etats, of a scientific and medicinal inability to fight natural disasters, those same infrastructural realities that allow people in America to sit, doing graphic design rather than dying of typhus, is the same thing that allows for these distribution and exposure avenues and pipelines. And so, while distribution and exposure bias might be a part of this story, I think it's really a small part, because I don't think you can separate that side of the artistic infrastructure from the side of the artistic infrastructure that allows an artist to do great things in the first place. So that's my view on this topic. Probably very boring to most, but it was interesting to me, certainly at the time anyway. And so let me know what you think. And as always, like, subscribe, and we will see you next time. Take care.